For centuries, it was a faith that pulsed just beneath the surface of the Roman Empire, a powerful rival to the burgeoning Christian movement. Its followers gathered in secret, deep underground. Its rituals were shrouded in mystery, and its influence stretched from the sun-scorched deserts of Syria all the way to the misty frontiers of Roman Britain. And then, almost in the blink of an historical eye, it was gone. It simply vanished. So the question we must ask is, what truly happened to the cult of Mithras? Was it stamped out in a brutal holy war, a victim of violent persecution? Or did it suffer a quieter, more complex fate? This is the mystery we're going to unravel.
You see, the popular story, the one that has been passed down for generations, is one of high drama and violent conflict. It's a narrative of a rising, and some would say intolerant Christianity, which, upon gaining political power, began to flex its newfound muscle, systematically and violently crushing its pagan competitors. But as we are about to see in this explainer, the latest archaeological findings and a deeper reading of history paint a far more nuanced and, I would argue, a far more fascinating picture. The truth, it seems, is rarely that simple.
So before we can properly investigate its disappearance, we must first understand who exactly we are dealing with. Who were the followers of Mithras? Now, Mithraism was not like the public pagan cults of Jupiter or Apollo with their grand, open-air temples and their citywide festivals. No, this was a classic mystery religion, meaning it was secretive, it was exclusive, and it offered a deeply personal path to salvation for its adherents.
Let's break down the very structure of this faith because it's key to understanding its ultimate fate. First, it was a closed system, accessible only to initiates. You had to be invited in. Once inside, members, or syndexio, progressed through 7 distinct stages of initiation, creating a powerful internal hierarchy. Their worship didn't happen in public squares. It took place in small, intimate, often underground temples called Mithraea, designed to look like caves. The central focus of their worship was the image of the Tarok Toni, Mithras slaying a sacred bull, an act of creation, and ritual banquets were absolutely central to their practice. Crucially, it was incredibly popular within 2 key groups, the Roman army and the imperial bureaucracy. This made it not just a religion, but an incredibly potent social and professional network that spanned the entire empire.
Just try to absorb the implications of that for a moment. By the 3rd century, Mithraism is arguably at its peak. It is a formidable force within Roman religious life, a true fortress of paganism. Yet a mere century later, by the early 5th century, it's effectively extinct. A belief system that powerful, that deeply embedded in the very fabric of the military and the state, doesn't just evaporate without a reason. The speed of its collapse is truly staggering. So what on earth could have happened to cause such a complete and total disappearance?
Well, for well over a century, the academic consensus supplied a simple, straightforward, and dramatic answer. It was deliberately destroyed. The traditional narrative argues that the end of Mithraism was the direct result of a campaign of violent persecution, orchestrated by Christians and backed by the full coercive power of the late Roman state.
And this interpretation really originates from the very highest authority. Franz Cumont, who is considered the founding father of modern Mithraic studies, was the one who set this tone. Looking at the archaeological record, at the smashed statues and desecrated temples, he saw clear evidence of what he memorably termed the devastating rage of Christians. And for decades, this powerful image of iconoclasm and holy war became the accepted truth, the standard explanation in textbooks and lecture halls.
And if you look at the legal record from the period, it seems to support this narrative completely. The laws passed throughout the 4th century show a clear and steady escalation of official anti-pagan policy. In 341, the state bans animal sacrifices, which would have struck at the very heart of the central Mithraic ritual. A few years later, in 356, edicts are passed ordering the closure of temples. By 392, all private polytheistic worship is prohibited. And then, the final blow. In 435, an imperial order for the complete destruction of any remaining pagan temples. On the surface, the case seems closed, doesn't it? It looks like a clear-cut, violent, top-down eradication. But this is where the story takes a turn. More recent scholarship has begun to pick at the threads of that simple, dramatic narrative. By looking much closer at the archaeological evidence and by re-examining the wider social and economic context of the late empire, a new and compelling theory has started to emerge. It's a theory not of a murder from the outside, but of a slow, steady decay from within.
And this is really the crucial paradigm-shifting question. What if the cult of Mithras was already in a state of terminal decline long before the Christians gained the power to suppress it?
What if those Christian attacks, where and when they did occur, were not the cause of death, but simply the final kick to an already rotting door? What if Mithraism was, in fact, a victim of its own internal weaknesses, tragically unable to adapt to the rapidly changing world of late antiquity?
So here we have the two competing models, side by side. The traditional explanation focuses entirely on external forces, Christian violence backed by imperial law. But the modern analysis shifts our gaze inward to what are called endogenous factors. It suggests the cult was suffering from a kind of internal decay, struggling with fundamental economic, social, and even theological problems that made it vulnerable. Instead of a healthy victim, this new analysis views Mithraism as a system already weakened and in decline.
And one of the most significant of these internal problems was, quite simply, money. Now, to understand this, we need to introduce a key concept from Roman social history: evergetism. In essence, this was the lifeblood of civic life across the empire. Wealthy aristocrats, high-ranking officials, and successful merchants would fund public works, temples, bathhouses, aqueducts, festivals out of their own personal fortunes. It was a way to display wealth, gain social status, and demonstrate piety. And Mithraism, like all cults, absolutely depended on this system to build, furnish, and maintain its temples. But herein lies the critical problem. As more and more members of the Roman elite began to convert to Christianity throughout the 4th century, they didn't stop this practice of evergeticism. They simply redirected their vast fortunes. The money that would have once funded a new Mithraeum was now being used to construct a grand new Christian basilica or to endow a monastery. The flow of cash that had sustained the Mithraic cult for centuries was slowly but surely diverted, leaving the cult to starve from a chronic lack of investment. Its financial foundations were crumbling. The problems went far beyond just money, however. The cult's decline can also be seen as the result of a fundamental clash of organizational models. You see, Mithraism and Christianity were built on entirely different structural principles. And in the unique social environment of late antiquity, one of those models was simply far better equipped to not just survive, but to thrive.
And this comparison truly illustrates the profound difference. Mithraism was, by its very design, exclusive and elitist. Its temples were small and hidden, its membership was limited. It had no public face, no open festivals, and no social outreach programs. It offered nothing tangible to the wider community. Christianity, on the other hand, was built for mass appeal. It was universal and open to everyone, men and women, rich and poor, slave and free. But more importantly, the early church functioned as a massive social security system, providing real, tangible support for the most vulnerable members of society: the poor, widows, and orphans. In that environment, a secret handshake and a ritual banquet in a cave simply could not compete with a system that offered food, shelter, and community. This fundamental clash extended all the way to their core theological approaches. Mithraism operated in what religious scholars call an imagistic mode. This means its beliefs were transmitted primarily through powerful, symbolic images and secret rituals, not through written texts. There was no Mithraic Bible, no public doctrine to be studied and debated. Christianity was the very opposite, a doctrinal religion. Its entire foundation was built upon written texts, the Gospels, the Epistles, and a complex philosophical theology defended by learned apologists, and it was spread through constant public preaching and instruction. In the great marketplace of ideas that was the late Roman Empire, a religion of the book, one that could be articulated, debated, and written down, simply outmaneuvered a religion of secret symbols.
So we have a cult that was being starved of cash and was being out-organized by its primary rival. But what about all those destroyed temples that Franz Cumont wrote about? Surely that physical evidence proves the violence narrative is at least partly true. Well, the final chapter of this story offers the most surprising twist of all, one that suggests a very different end for many of the followers of Mithras.
Let's move from the theoretical to the specific, with a fascinating case study. In Thiene, a town in modern-day Belgium, archaeologists began the excavation of a known Mithraeum. Now, based on the traditional story, they went in with a clear set of expectations. They were looking for the classic signs of Christian destruction: smashed idols, layers of ash and charcoal from fires, the general chaos of a violent desecration. But that is not what they found. Not at all.
What they uncovered was simply incredible. The site was completely devoid of any signs of violence or vandalism. Instead of chaos, they found order. They discovered a large pit where the cult's ritual artifacts, pottery, ceremonial vessels, even the bones from their meals, had been carefully and respectfully buried. The analysis of these remains showed that just before the temple was abandoned,
The members had gathered for one last grand farewell feast. The evidence points not to a violent raid, but to a respectful, planned closure carried out by the cult members themselves. They held one last banquet, buried their sacred items, and then they simply walked away.
This single discovery has the power to completely reshape the entire narrative. It demonstrates with hard archaeological evidence that the end of Mithraism was not always a violent confrontation. In some places, it seems, it was a quiet, deliberate, and perhaps even melancholy choice, made by the believers themselves as they saw the writing on the wall and decided to close the door on their own faith.
But perhaps the most strategically brilliant move that Christianity made was not economic, social, or even legal. It was theological. The church leadership seemed to realize something profound. Why fight a bloody war to destroy your rival's most powerful and popular ideas when you can simply take them for yourself?
And this is the clearest, most famous example of that strategy. Mithras, as a solar deity closely linked to the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, had his divine birth celebrated on the winter solstice, December 25th. This was one of the most important and joyous dates in the entire pagan calendar. So what did the church do? In the 4th century, it made the momentous decision to place the birth of Jesus Christ on that exact same day.
This was nothing short of a strategy of conquest through assimilation. It was an act of theological genius. By co-opting the sacred calendar of its chief rival, Christianity made the transition for converting pagans almost seamless. They could continue to celebrate a festival of light and rebirth on the darkest day of the year, but now they would be doing so in the name of a new savior. It was a brilliant move that demolished the psychological barriers to conversion for countless people.
So when we assemble all the pieces of this complex puzzle, the simple, dramatic story of a holy war dissolves into something far more intricate. The end of Mithras was not a simple murder. It was a sophisticated sociological replacement. It was a faith that was outmaneuvered on every conceivable front, financially, institutionally, and theologically. It wasn't just brutally suppressed, it was made obsolete, and then its most valuable symbolic assets were carefully absorbed by the competition.
And that leaves us with a fascinating and perhaps provocative final thought. This story is more than just a piece of ancient history. The quiet disappearance of Mithras demonstrates that sometimes the most effective way to win in the great competition of ideas is not through censorship or brute force. It is by offering a more compelling vision, a better organizational structure, and a more adaptable message. What then does that tell us about the great ideological and cultural contests that define our own time? That is a question worth pondering.